Friedman wrote this in 1982. He said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." That there is the manifesto of what I call disaster capitalism, the taking advantage of a moment of crisis, of extreme cataclysmic change, of confusion, and using it to loot the public sphere. I want to give a few examples of the application of this shock doctrine, this crisis theory, because it gives an alternative view of how these ideas triumphed. We're at a moment right now where we are seeing this same ideology imposed with ever escalating levels of violence. The reconstruction of Lebanon after the Israeli attack is used as an opportunity by the World Bank and the IMF to demand that they privatize water and electricity. The reconstruction of Iraq that is used as a cover to push through an oil law that will continue to loot Iraq for the next 30 years. The world owes Iraq reparations. That's probably not going to happen. But on top of denying Iraqis reparations, the only chance of that country rebuilding itself is if it maintains control over its oil revenue, and that is what is being taken advantage of in the current crisis in Iraq, this so-called civil war. I think we don't have the analysis to understand the level of violence that is being used to impose neoliberalism, whether it's taking advantage of a crisis like Katrina or Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon. We don't have the language to talk about it because we have accepted this fairy tale version of history. We have allowed the right to cleanse the violence from their own triumphs. So now we're surprised, we're taken off guard by the level of violence that we see today. So I want to give 4 examples of the shocks that get left out of the stories. The non-fairy tale version of this story. The first is Chile under Pinochet, which is a story that all of you know, I'm sure. The second is the way in which Margaret Thatcher used the Falklands War to push through her radical privatization program. The third is the way Deng Xiaoping used the Tiananmen Square massacre to push through radical neoliberalism in China. And the fourth is how Yeltsin used a violent attack on the Russian parliament and the suspension of democracy in that country in order to impose economic shock therapy. Now, these are 4 examples. There are many, many more. But I think that if we look at this history, our present makes sense. This talk is about becoming shock resistant. And I believe that knowing this history is what makes us shock resistant. If we look at places that are becoming shock resistant, like Latin America, it's because they understand where the current attacks fit into a 500-year history of taking advantage of crisis, of violent imposition of capitalism. And that is what makes social movements strong, having our eyes wide open, not false optimism. So in Chile, you had 3 distinct shocks. This was really the first place where Milton Friedman and the so-called Chicago Boys were able to impose their textbook ideas. They weren't able to do it in the United States. Nixon when he was elected, Milton Friedman was convinced he was going to get the chance to bring his, what he called a liberal revolution, a free market revolution to the United States, but it didn't work because Americans didn't want it. And Nixon ended up becoming, in Milton Friedman's words, the most socialist president the United States has had in the post-war period because he imposed wage and price controls. He did it to win an election because these policies were not compatible with democracy. And when he did it, he was almost as popular as FDR. He won 60% of the popular vote, and then he was impeached. But it was because of, as he said, we're all Keynesians now. So Nixon threw Friedman a bone, and that bone was Chile. They had a laboratory where they were able to test these ideas. They also had a group of roughly 100 Chilean students who had studied at the University of Chicago. You know, Seth was talking earlier about the importance of training young people and having a new generation of public intellectuals. Well, let me tell you, they knew this at the Chicago School in 1957 when they created what they called the Chile Project to take on the so-called pink economists of Latin America. And they trained up this generation, and they went home to wage a battle of ideas, and they lost miserably. They lost miserably, as the 1973 election of Salvador Allende showed. They couldn't win a battle of ideas. All three major political parties in the 1973 election in Chile supported nationalizing the copper mines. They were off the political map. They came back with tanks. They rode in on Pinochet's tanks. The second day of the coup, every general, every member of the junta, had a document that they called the BRIC because it was so thick. And what it was a neoliberal economic program that was basically a reiteration of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. It was everything from privatizing Social Security to charter schools, to tax cuts, to free trade. And they did it all. They did it so fast that Milton Friedman came up with a new name for it. He called it shock treatment. That was the second shock. The first shock was the coup. And while the country was still reeling, they were hit with the second shock, the shock treatment. And just to make sure that people stayed in line, there was a third shock, and that shock was torture. That was the bodily shocks inflicted on the bodies of labor organizers, of soup kitchen workers, of members of left-wing political parties. It was a warning to the whole culture. We are seeing this same triple shock formula imposed again. In Iraq, we had a war that called itself shock and awe, that was designed specifically as a psychological program as well as a military program. It was followed immediately by the most ambitious economic shock therapy program ever attempted in any country. That was Paul Bremer. When he wrote in, he bragged that Baghdad was still burning when he passed the flat tax law, 15% flat tax. And one of his undersecretaries said, the whole Republican Party in the United States is jealous of your tax law. This was a great comfort to Iraqis. And when people resisted, they met with that third shock. They met with that third shock and continue to this day. Now, many of us do know this history, but it's kind of blamed on those, Latin America is a violent continent. That's why it happened there. There are human rights abuses, but it didn't have anything to do with the economic program. And we heard this narrative when Pinochet died this past year. Terrible man, human rights abuser, but did wonders for the economy. There was no connection made between the two. And of course, the movement that had claimed Chile at the time as a laboratory quickly tried to forget this embarrassing incident, much as Hollywood stars tried to forget their early soap opera work. Latin America was an embarrassing glitch in the era of Thatcher and Reagan, the democratic, the moment where the movement was imposed in Western democracies. Well, Thatcher's case is interesting. It's interesting because for her first 3 years in office, she really wasn't able to impose any of these policies. She tried to. She tried to. She became so unpopular that she was less popular than any leader had ever been in the history of opinion polling. In 1982, she had an approval rating of 25%, less than Bush, and her political party had an approval rating of 18%, and they were a year away from elections. Not looking good for the Thatcher revolution. And they hadn't done anything. They hadn't done any of the major privatizations. They hadn't busted any of the unions, and they were heading straight for defeat. What happened? Well, in Argentina, they put the flag in the Falkland Islands. And actually, it was the Argentine junta that was trying to save their own project by doing this. Borges at the time described the dispute as two bald men fighting over a comb, because nobody really wanted those islands. But the islands were useful to both regimes. The junta in Argentina thought they could use anti-imperialist sentiment to save their regime, and Thatcher thought that she could have a last blast for British Empire and save her neoliberal project, and it worked. Not since September 11th's renovation of George W. Bush has a political leader been so renovated by war. She went from 25 to 59% in the polls, sailed to victory in the 1983 elections, and at that point busted the miners' strikes, busted the blue-collar unions, and pushed through the most radical privatization spree ever attempted in a Western democracy. Was that peace and democracy? Thatcher relied on these shocks, on the exploitation of crisis, to push through policies that were clearly rejected by the majority of people. One of the interesting things in my research has been looking at some of these incidents about the transitions that communist countries have made to so-called free market ideology, and looking at the way they were covered in the Western press at the time, versus the stories that are now, the narratives that are now emerging in these countries. Now, Tiananmen, the Tiananmen Square massacre was reported in the Western press as exclusively students who wanted democracy up against a communist regime that wanted to protect its own power and was willing to use enormous force. Another narrative is emerging from China's New Left, self-described New Left, which is that, in fact, it was not only students. That these were protests against, lo and behold, Milton Friedman prescribed shock therapy program, that it was overwhelmingly workers who were opposed to the deregulation of their wages, the lifting of price controls, and the widening disparity. People wanted democracy, but they wanted democracy for a reason. They wanted democracy to oversee the economic transformation so that it could be widely shared and not simply be a transfer of wealth from the party elite to a new corporate oligarchy. When those protests threatened that economic project, then the tanks came in, then the tanks rolled. And it was the shock of Tiananmen that created the workforce in China that has been so profitable to so many corporations. The raw terror of a state that is willing to go to such lengths to roll over their students, their workers. That was a message, and it was the same message that workers got in Latin America with their shocks. That's how neoliberalism came to China. Now, in Russia, which was the next great success story for the movement, Gorbachev brought democracy in before he brought in the free market reforms. He didn't want neoliberalism. He wanted what he described as a new kind of socialism, a socialist beacon to the world. He wanted something on the model of Scandinavian social democracy. Well, he was shut down by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and rapidly ousted by Yeltsin. He had a team of economists who called themselves the Chicago Boys because they had learned everything they knew by reading pirated copies of Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose, during the communist years. They weren't actually Chicago boys. They were sort of knockoff Chicago boys, but that's fitting for Russia because it has a very big black market. So